Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to talk about Ilford's Ilfotec DD-X black and white film developer and what you need to know about it in terms of safety, handling and disposal. This video is sponsored by the folks at thephotoshop.ie who have partnered with me for this educational video and video series on photographic chemical safety. We'll talk more about them towards the end, so for now, let's get into it. Before we really get into it, I do have to give my usual legal disclaimer. The opinions expressed within this video are my own professional and educated opinions as someone whose job focuses heavily on chemical waste disposal, but they are just my opinions and don't constitute legal advice on my own behalf or the behalf of the folks at thephotoshop.ie. Nothing I say in these videos can or does overrule or supersede your local laws and regulations. If you want to drop a general comment down below about some general advice, that's perfectly fine, but for any pressing matters or very niche specific cases, you're better off consulting your city, council or other regulatory board. As we go through the video, I'm going to rate DD-X on a scale from 1 to 3 in each category of safety, handling, disposal, and of course cost, and then we'll tally those scores up at the end. Ilfotec DD-X, or just DD-X, is a high-performance black and white film developer from Ilford that reduces the silver ions in your exposed emulsion onto those latent image seed crystals, growing them into the grains that make up the silver grains in your final images. It is a very high-performance developer that Ilford say offers full emulsion speed, good performance when pushing, and a wide range of tones from your shadows through to your highlights, making the negatives particularly good for darkroom printing. It's not a developer you would see very commonly in labs because, well, for reasons that we'll see later, but for home use it's much more common, and a lot of the people I know who use it personally swear by DD-X and the results that it gives, especially people who print in the darkroom, so this really is a very darkroom friendly developer. Ilford single out an interesting combination in the datasheet, saying that this film is particularly ideal as the developer of choice for Delta 3200, which is a film I've personally struggled to get nice results with in the past, so that is something I'm going to have to try going forward. Lastly, a lot of people online seem to say that this film, broadly speaking in terms of its performance, can be considered a liquid version of the Microfen developer, which is a powder developer, giving overall similar results. I haven't personally tested those two side by side, but if you're interested in one, maybe that's something worth considering. Aside from just being a liquid concentrate developer, DD-X is only available in 1 litre size, not smaller or larger bottles. And it's normally used at either a 1+4 dilution, which is the standard, or a 1+9 dilution, which Ilford say is more or less comparable, and some people online say is exactly the same. Ilford say that you can reuse the 1+4 working solution exactly once with a slight reduction in image quality, or for 1 litre of working solution you can do up to 10 rolls of film if you extend the development time accordingly, but with a warning about, subpar image quality. They're really emphasizing that this developer is intended to be used to generate high quality negatives, and using it in any way other than the intended way kind of compromises that, so to speak. It's a decently strong solvent developer due to the sulfide content, which means it's suitable for any film, not just the classic cubic grain films, but also particularly usable with the tabular T-grain films like Kodak's T-Max lineup and Ilford's own Delta lineup, not just Delta 3200. It works well with all of them. A lot of people online seem to say that the grain is very fine, but not quite as fine as something like X-Tol, which again, going back to the darkroom side of things, a lot of people say is actually a good thing, because the slight bit of acutance and texture that the grain retains compared to something like X-Tol makes it easy to actually focus on the grain when trying to focus your enlarger in a darkroom. There are reports online of people using, say, Pan-F or T-Max 100 with Kodak X-Tol, and the grain being so fine that they actually can't focus the image as well, like if you're trying to print CMS-20. That's very much a hit and miss, just guess and hope you get it right kind of thing. So the fact the grain isn't quite so fine is another one of its many wins in favor of darkroom users. Diethylene glycol at 5 to 10% will slightly inhibit oxidation, but not to a serious degree, but it mainly inhibits fungal growth, prolonging the shelf life of the overall developer, and it acts as an organic solvent that helps maintain the solubility of the various organic components in the water, because these things are often not soluble in water on their own, preventing them from precipitating out, which basically kills the developer. Hydroquinone at 1 to 5% is there as your primary developer, reducing the silver ions to metallic silver at the surface of your latent image grains, growing those from seed crystals of just 3 to 4 silver atoms into your actual grains in your negatives. Disodium tetraborate and boric acid each at 1 to 5%, are both their source of borate, which is an accelerator under alkaline conditions. But the use of both of these specifically, the conjugate base and the acid, probably work as a pH buffer to stabilize the pH in the working solution, keeping everything working at its kind of optimum level. Pentasodium pentate, or the sodium salt of pentetic acid at less than 1%, is a chelating agent. If you're familiar with EDTA, it's exactly the same thing, but it's bigger brother and it has an extra arm. Chelating agents bind to metal ions in the water, basically stopping them from interfering in the development process, which they will. Things like iron bind very strongly to things that have free oxygen atoms, to keep it very simple, and our developers have free oxygen atoms, which is the part of the developer that actually reduces the silver. It's the source of the electrons. So we don't want that to happen. As for why this formula uses pentetic acid rather than EDTA, or their sodium salts, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe this formula is particularly sensitive to heavy metal contamination, or maybe the idea is just that you shouldn't need to use deionized water when you're using DD-X. I'm not exactly sure. It's probably not a cost thing because I believe EDTA and its salts are much cheaper just because they're far more common. So I'm leaning more towards the fact that the pentetic acid, sodium salt, has the extra arm and is able to bind more strongly and it's more effective as a chelating agent. Again, not 100% sure. Dimazone S at 0.1 to 1% is a secondary developer that works with the hydroquinone to grow your silver crystals during development. It's used instead of phenidone because it's more stable and more active. It's faster under alkaline conditions, and DD-X is quite a basic developer. Here it will also specifically improve contrast boundaries and reduce bleeding at high contrast edges caused by silver migration during the development process. I'm not sure how well it does that task compared to dimazone, regular dimazone or phenidone, but apparently that's why it's there. I mentioned earlier that this is a solvent developer because of its sulfide content, but I haven't listed any source of sulfide here. Although not listed in section 2, section 15 does mention that the formula includes potassium sulfide, but doesn't say how much. This is probably just a legal requirement, or the lack of a legal requirement, because potassium sulfide is a safe food preservative, so it's probably just not required that they list it because it's non-toxic. That said, it would be nice to know how much potassium sulfide is in here, because that would be useful to know if you're trying to figure out, if you're trying to rationalize differences in image quality between the 1+4 and 1+9 dilution. It would be good to know if you're going below that kind of critical threshold for solvent action with sulfide, but that's a whole other can of worms. Treated as a one-shot developer and used at 1+4 as recommended, 1 liter of DD-X stock concentrate can get you 16 rolls of 35mm film or just 10 rolls of 120. You don't have very high developing capacity with this developer. That works out to what, 60 to 65 4x5 sheets. Of course, using it 1+9, using rotary processing, or reusing a 1+4 solution for some number of times will extend that, but used as truly intended, yeah, capacity is quite low. Ilford say that the shelf life of a full unopened bottle is about 2 years, and they say that once you've opened the bottle and used half of it, if you've got the lid, tightly secured and whatnot, you can expect it to last about 4 more months. In reality, you can go way beyond 4 months by using a butane spray, and I have friends who've got bottles that are well over 2 years old that are still working just great. This is probably Ilford erring this on the side of being safe and giving you a recommendation, that will maintain, again, optimum, maximum performance, rather than talking about when the developer will die, talking about when it will no longer live up to their very high standards for this product. In terms of the working solution, they say no more than 24 hours. Whether you're going to reuse it or not, chuck it after a day. First, a quick reminder that an SDS refers to the product as you receive it, not necessarily as you're going to be using it. In this case, the SDS refers to the stock concentrate and not the 1+4 or 1+9 working solutions, though Ilford do actually provide a separate SDS for the 1+4 working solution, for which they deserve some praise. For consistency with other videos in the series, and just because you have to handle the concentrate to prepare the working solution yourself, we are going to be looking at the SDS for the concentrate though. Section 2 tells us that DD-X is corrosive, harmful to aquatic life, mutagenic, meaning it screws up your DNA, maybe a skin sensitizer, can damage your unborn fetus if you happen to be pregnant, can damage your actual fertility full stop, and generally is not a very nice formulation. It's not as bad as something like D76 that we looked at before, still not exactly super nice. Section 4 is again as boilerplate and standard as you can get. This is the equivalent of not having a Section 4 fundamentally. I mean, this is the standard that you put in absolutely any SDS. There's nothing notable or specific here. I think going forward, I am just going to gloss over Section 4 to save your time and mine and only point out the most notable useful information, because if you are following this series, which I can see from analytics quite a few of you are, as a playlist, this is all stuff that you've seen before and I don't need to point it out every single time. Section 6 says to avoid getting it on your skin or in your eyes, and it doesn't say not to drink it, but I presume you've figured that part out by now if you've gotten to this age. It also says that anything more than a small spill should not be washed down the drain and should be dealt with separately. That's more relevant to industrial scale because an SDS has to deal with everything from home use up to industrial scale unless it specifies the context for any particular section. Section 8 recommends wearing glasses, gloves, maybe wearing body protection, and to have some decent ventilation. I would say ventilation isn't super important here because none of the components are super noxious, and body protection may not be necessary, but gloves and eye protection are strongly recommended. I would at least recommend wearing something that would cover your arms, something with sleeves. If you're not going to wear like a lab coat, which is definitely excessive for home use, just try and protect your bare skin somewhat. You could use longer gloves if you're able to get those, but for reasons we'll see in Section 11, yeah, you don't want to get this stuff on your skin. Oh look, Section 11. It breaks down the toxicity in a bit more detail. The LD50, the lethal dose 50%, is quite high and very specific, which in a way is concerning, but it does show that you would need to ingest a huge amount of DD-X to see acute harm. But acute harm isn't the only type of harm. We have mutagenicity and carcinogenicity, which are very bad problems long term, potential damage to your fertility and to your unborn fetus if you happen to be pregnant while exposed, and also the fact that it's a skin sensitizer. I spoke about this in the D76/ID11 video with Metol, which is more potent as a skin sensitizer, so it's more of a problem there. But basically, skin sensitization to chemicals is where you develop a chemical allergy to something over time. It doesn't have to be one exposure, it can be a very tiny exposure hundreds of times, and then, you go from being able to use this developer no problem to one day being suddenly allergic to it, breaking out in painful scaly rashes and maybe getting infections if you could get a fungal infection if your skin gets damaged in that kind of way. Although less bad than other developers, I do have to give DD-X a 1 out of 3 for safety. The carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, fertility damage, risk of damage to unborn fetuses, skin sensitization and general corrosion are not to be taken lightly, even if it isn't as bad as other things, and the stock concentrate is only diluted 1+4 by default, or 1+9 if you really do dilute it. It's not like you're diluting it 1+100 and then using a really dilute working solution, so the risks aren't mitigated that much by dilution. Much in the same way as D76 going from stock to 1+1 doesn't really change much, so yeah. 1 out of 3 seems fair here. Section 7 doesn't say anything that we haven't already covered, and that's probably exactly the same manner in which I'm going to be covering Section 4 going forwards. On the other hand, Section 10 notes that you shouldn't mix it with strong acids. Now, I've said this before, but I want to reiterate that strong acid and a concentrated acid are not the same thing, and you using your stop bath with DD-X doesn't count as a strong acid for this purposes. The risks would be generation of large amounts of heat, noxious sulfur oxides, that kind of thing. That's not going to happen if you use a stop bath. That's more like if you're making your own homemade stop bath from hydrochloric, muriatic acid if you're in the States, or like sulfuric acid and that kind of thing, then you would be more concerned about the risk of liberating these noxious gases. And then if you're in that kind of world, that's entirely on you. Used properly with a normal stop bath or water as a stop bath, it's not something you need to be concerned about. On a more practical note, DD-X has that standard wide neck you see with all Ilford chemical bottles, which prevents or limits the risk of gurgling and splashing when you're pouring the developer by allowing air in as you're letting the developer out. And it is a bit thicker than water, but it's not super syrupy, so it's very easy to pour, mix, and clean up. Being a liquid concentrate means you also don't have to deal with a powder at all. You don't have to deal with mixing up a huge stock. You can just make up what you need. You don't have to deal with the time and effort and potentially heat it requires to actually prepare those stock solutions from powders. And just generally, powders are more risky to handle. You have dusts going into the air, and then ventilation and respirators and all that kind of thing become more serious concerns. Also, the fact that the dilutions are 1+4, 1+9 makes the calculations super easy. I mean, 500 ml at 1+4, 100 ml plus 400 ml, super easy. What's 500 ml at 1+63 for HC110 dilution F? I don't know, I can work it out, but it's not as simple or intuitive, and there's a lot to be said for simplicity in its use, and that's exactly what DD-X is. It's just really nice and simple and easy to use. Lastly, I'd say it's subjectively nice that the times are a bit longer, but not painfully long. You know, it's mostly in the kind of 8 to 9 minute range for a lot of films at 1+4, which is fine. I mean, 4 to 5 minutes, you're starting to worry about uneven development, especially with larger tanks with a very long drain and fill time. 12 to 15 minutes is a bit of a drag and you're starting to get tired and bored as things go on. 8, 9 minutes, that's a perfectly good time, and it's a really nice balance between managing your time and ensuring even development, which again feeds into that whole thing of high quality negatives. 3 out of 3 for handling for DD-X, super easy decision there. For our purposes, Section 12 just says that the reason for the aquatic toxicity is the presence of hydroquinone in the developer formulation. If you've been following this series, or just more generally, if you know about photographic formulation or hydroquinone, you already knew that, but if you didn't, this is the only part that's relevant here. Then Section 13 throws back to what I said in Section 6 earlier, that used, spent, diluted working solutions can go down the drain if it isn't, against your local laws and regulations. And that makes more sense, because once it's been spent and used, the working solution is actually, not as potent. The quinones formed from the hydroquinone are not great for the environment, but they're better off overall. And again, we're talking about a smaller scale. Realistically, to contradict Section 6 earlier, I would say that's more referring to larger scales, and if you have like a quarter of a bottle of DD-X and the bottle has gone bad and it's not giving good results anymore, that quarter bottle can go down the drain, but you would have to wear PPE to dispose of it safely and, thoroughly rinse the sink and all that kind of usual thing. The other thing is, it does specifically say spent working solutions, and using the developer once, it's not spent if you can reuse it. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to reuse it. But Ilford do say that the working solution has a shelf life of about a day. So what you could do is leave it in maybe an uncapped bottle, or maybe vigorously shake it to get oxygen into, to oxygenate and aerate the water. Just leave it for a day or two before you pour it down the drain, so that it will just passively oxidize and die, and then you can get rid of it. Not completely mindless, but not super bad either. I am a bit torn about what score to give DD-X here. I gave multigrade paper developer a 3 out of 3, but that's used in trays where the rate of oxidation and self-quenching is much higher, and it's used at much higher dilutions. But, D76 I gave a 2 out of 3, and it is a bit worse for the environment, but, your dilution 1 to 3 is much more like DD-X's 1 to 4. Even the 1 to 1 is much more similar. You're not diluting DD-X too much to make your working solutions. And again, the formula is much more like Ilford multigrade than it is like D76, so I'm really not sure, but I'm going to give it a 2 out of 3 for now and reserve the right, as I kind of implicitly do anyway, to adjust any of these scores and give you a better indication as time goes on. If standards change and I come across something that really forces me to shuffle everything around, that's fine, because it's more about the relative scoring than the absolute score. I mean, 2 out of 3 isn't a legally binding environmental regulation or recommendation. It's more just to give you an idea of what's better and what's worse. So for now, 2 out of 3 for disposal. DD-X is about 37 to 40 euros for a 1 litre bottle, and you can only get it in 1 litre size. You can't get it in a larger size, where economies of scale and bulk buying make it much more affordable. So that's like, if used per Ilford's instructions for 10 to 16 rolls, you're talking 3 to 4 euros per roll to develop, versus like €1-ish for stock, unreplenished, unreused D76 ID11, like 50 cents for dilution BHC110, and a few tens of cents for something like Rodinol. It is much more expensive than other developers, and that is the cost for getting the high performance that it gives you. You get excellent negatives, but you can't really reuse it if you want that high performance, and you really do have to pay a lot to get that stock concentrate. Again, a lot of people I know swear by it, and the results do seem to speak for themselves. You just have to weigh up whether it's worth it for you to pay for that performance versus another more economical developer. But for the sake of being objective and consistent with this series, I've always said, well, not always on camera, but I have always said that DD-X is my benchmark for a grossly expensive black and white film developer, so I'm giving it a 1 out of 3 for cost. Before I tally up the scores, I of course have to give a huge shout out and thanks to the folks at thephotoshop.ie for sponsoring this video and video series. They are a pleasure to deal with as always, and they continue to listen to us, the local community, to see what we need and how they can help us pursue our photographic art, helping to keep the craft alive, as they say. I recently picked up some Rollei RPX 225 to try out. I know what you're gonna say, but yes, I know. And obviously a lot more Harmon Phoenix, because at the time I'm recording this video, I'm still on my Harmon Phoenix only binge. I've been shooting so much of that film, and it's just great that I'm able to get it so easily with such fast delivery. Even if you're not in Ireland, their prices are so highly competitive with the likes of Photo Impex and Retro Camera, the other big European retailers, that sometimes it might actually be worth paying for international shipping, so it's worth keeping an eye out. Otherwise, it might be worth signing up for the newsletter where they announce upcoming events, put the spotlight on certain products, and let you know what's coming up in Brendan's bargain basement from time to time. Thanks again to the folks at the Photoshop.ie for sponsoring this video and helping to keep the craft alive. Now, let's tally up the scores. Ilford's Ilfotec DD-X gets a 1 out of 3 for safety, 3 out of 3 for handling, 2 out of 3 for disposal, and 1 out of 3 for cost, for a total score of 7 out of 12. So I know I'm repeating myself ad nauseum here, but Ilfotec DD-X is a very high-end developer that gives excellent results pretty much all the time, super consistently, if you use it properly. You can go outside of spec with varying results, but that's not really what this developer is for. This developer does cost a lot of money, and you do have to pay for that high performance, but you get a lot for your money, especially if you're into the world of darkroom printing. Even if you're not, the quality that you get with the negatives may be worth considering just for the sake of the negatives themselves. I myself am strongly considering integrating DD-X more into my workflow going forward, particularly for black and white rolls where I put a lot more effort in. You know, if I've hiked up Ticknock or out somewhere in Kerry or Donegal or whatever with either the SL66 or the 4x5 and put a lot of time and effort into my compositions with movements and calculating reciprocity, maybe if I ever invest in grad filters, why not spend 2 or 3 euros more than I normally would to develop that film and get the best out of it? You know, if I've gone to so much effort to take the photographs, maybe that money is actually worth it. For everyday street photography and that kind of thing with like XX, yeah, I'm not using DD-X for that. That's way too much money for that kind of photography for me, because that's quality isn't really the goal there, but for landscape photography and more deliberate and high-end work, so to speak, I think DD-X is actually a lot easier to justify than the high cost might first make it seem, I guess. That's all I have to say about DD-X for this video, so stay safe and bye bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.